Are you a history major?
I am. I'm a history and applied math double major.
And a math?
Yes, sir.
What do you want to do?
I'm not quite sure.
Well, academia is not lucrative.
Right. Well, I'm not interested in academia.
I farmed and I had 3 kids and I lived in an old house and I was making $25,000 and something told me. One day I spoke to a business group and they said, you're either going to have to write books or speak or do something because you're headed toward poverty.
Wow.
And that was really shocking to somebody tell me that in my 30s.
Wow.
And he was right, so I started writing books.
And it was also because of farming, right? Because someone came in and wanted to publish your doctoral thesis, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it was very odd. A man named Emilio Gaba, he's a very famous classicist. He just happened to be in Berkeley. And I was farming. I had finished my PhD thesis 3 years earlier. And I got a letter out of the blue. He was the visiting Sather professor, was one of the top professorships. Very nice letter. He said, we're from the University of Padua and we would like to publish your thesis. And I was on a tractor when my wife gave me the letter. And he said, you don't have to do anything. And then they published it and it went to John Keegan. And the next thing I knew, he wrote it and liked it and said, if you write another book, I will write the foreword.
Wow.
So I wrote a book called The Western Way of War about what it was like to fight in the ancient world. And the next thing I know, he wrote the foreword and it sold very well. So for somebody in their early and mid 30s, it was kind of unusual. Because I farmed for 20 years and then I would get off the tractor and go in and teach 25 miles away, sometimes twice a day.
Wow.
So it was kind of a hectic life.
I kind of like that though. The best teachers I've ever had, like in high school or whatever, I've always done something else other than teaching, right?
Yeah, you have to. But it was very schizophrenic because all of the things that I was supposed to do at the campus was antithetical to what I was doing in farming. You were supposed to be very careful what you said, and it was very relaxed. And, you know, there were some pretty wild characters out in the Central Valley that, on farming, you know, that stealing your water or,
Wow.
you know, other farmers that would, you know, fight over a road or who had the right to turn or you're making your turns too big. And then it was pretty blunt. And then you go up there, it was kind of such a different change every day. That
Kind of had to be John Wayne a little bit.
Yeah, I wrote a couple of books about it.
So speaking of books, right, you've got one coming out very soon on citizenship. It's called The Dying Citizen. And, you know, I'm an American citizen, right? I was born a citizen. I didn't have to do anything special to kind of get that. Why is this idea important?
Well, let me ask you, are you shocked that 2 million people are scheduled to walk across the southern border?
Well, absolutely.
And without any ID, no background check. And the first thing they do is going to break federal immigration law, and it won't be. The second thing they're going to do is break federal immigration law by residing here illegally. And the third is probably they're going to have ID that is not legal to continue to. And this is all at a time when all of us are supposed to be vaccinated.
Right.
Or we're looking at pictures of people landing, and we all support legitimate refugees coming, but they are arriving in bases without any requirement as foreign nationals to be vaccinated by troops who have a deadline that they have to be vaccinated. And so, or where I live, we have school board elections now where people who are not U.S. citizens can vote. Or all of the traditional privileges of citizenship, only citizens could leave the United States at will with a passport. That no longer applies. Citizens usually were the people who were eligible for state services. That no longer applies. Citizens alone could hold office. That is still there. It's the only one I can think of that distinguishes you and I from
Right.
a resident, whether legal or not. They can vote in some cases, serve in the military. So I was curious about all this, and I tried to find out why that was historically and what was so good about citizenship, because I would bump in where I live. Most of the people I bumped into out in rural Fresno County were not citizens. And I had no idea whether they were legal or illegal residents. It was chaotic. There were caste, as it were, and I didn't have a commonality with them because they just came across the border.
Right.
And then when you look at classical texts, the first thing you see is a middle class. They're not envious of the rich, and they're not dependent on government as the poor are, and they're not always cajoling as the rich are to get quid pro quo concessions. And Aristotle talks about the mesoi, And yet, if you look at middle class income, college tuition debt, credit card debt, the middle class is beleaguered, especially under globalization. The people in the interior of the country, they didn't have the skills that could be internationalized.
Right.
And what was weird about it is it has repercussions. The date people are getting married is gone from about 23 to 29. The first child is from about 24 to 31. The date when people buy their first home. So we're creating a prolonged, like you use the term pajama boy, or Life of Julia, those commercials we saw during Obamacare, prolonged adolescence. And then I also noticed in this organic process, it was almost like the migrations of the late empire. People were just coming and going, and there wasn't a sacred space, a familiar landscape where people had a chance to reiterate their customs, their traditions, their familiarity with citizens. And yet that had been a hallmark of classical Greek and Roman citizenship, to the point people went to war if their borders were impaired, say in Greece. And yet we've lost that element. Then the big bane of citizenship was always a pre-civilizational, pre-modern tribalism. So you and I have nothing in common as U.S. citizens, only a superficial, say we look alike. And we're going to identify first with our racial or ethnic tribe. In other words, race is essential, not incidental to who we are. And that leads nowhere but to Rwanda or Iraq or the former Yugoslavia. And yet that's what we're doing right now. We're regressing back to 1840, 1850, and we're all in this woke movement. And then the second half of the book really quickly is that there's an elite concentrated effort to dismantle citizenship. And you can see it with the rejection of the word equality, which means equality of opportunity, replaced by equity and quality of result. Government is going to redistribute income and advantage, often by race and gender. So what are they doing? How do they facilitate that agenda? One thing is we have a permanent administrative state. We always have. It started really during the Depression with the New Deal and the Great Society, but now about 45% of Americans, 40%, work for the state, local, or federal government. Then we have evolutionaries. You probably have seen these, or you know them, academics, lawyers, activists, and they don't like the Constitution. That's a big issue here at Hillsdale. So what do they want to do? They want to evolve beyond it. So we're going to get rid of a 180-year filibuster, not in the Constitution, but it's a custom and tradition. The Electoral College is 233 years, junk it. The idea that a state like Michigan or California sets their own voting laws, even for national elections, unless the federal government wants to come in for women's right, suffrage or 18-year-old vote, but we're going to try to junk that. 150-year-old 9-person Supreme Court, 60-year-old 50 states in the Union. I could go on, but when the system doesn't work for the progressive mindset, then either change the demography or change the rules or change the whole constitutional apparatus by which we make laws and elect officials. And then finally in the book I have a danger that I'm really worried about, and that's globalization. It's an ancient idea, cosmopolitanism, which is a Greek word for citizen of the world. But a lot of our elites, our bi-coastal elites, feel that whether it's the Davos Great Reset Project or the International Criminal Court or UN Commission on Human Rights should trump U.S. sovereignty. They feel we're sort of an anomaly. We're weird people that have Second Amendment or abortion laws, banning types of abortion. We need to get with it. And you can see that when Anthony Blinken, our current Secretary of State, says that the UN should come in and investigate us. I could go on, but that's a very dangerous idea. Globalization was wonderful in giving Western consumer products, medicines, all over the world, but the idea that you would take the next step and harmonize political norms and institutions outside of the United States that are far inferior is really dangerous.
Right, and I think there is some sort of perhaps a loathing, I guess, of American exceptionalism or something, and there's a desire to change things. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, Barack Obama, you remember, he had said on 2 occasions, I believe we're exceptional like the Greeks or the British. In other words, everybody believes there are, but he made no effort to quantify that in a dispassionate, empirical fashion. Do other countries have due process? Do they have habeas corpus? Do they have a free market? Do they have rights of inheritance? Do they have a rational system of adjudicating natural phenomena or scientific inquiry? Do they have gender equity? Do they have minority rights? No. Most of the 198 nations in the world do not. But this hatred of America, I think it comes from, to be quite frank, from envy and jealousy, because this country only has 330 million people. It's not nearly as big as China, either area-wise or population, has 1.4 billion. Why is it so powerful? Why does it have the largest economy? Why does one U.S. worker at this late date in American history still produce 40% more goods and services than 3 of his Chinese counterparts?
Wow.
And when they look at popular culture, why are American music, all over the world, I think, just stop it, you guys. So they never make the next step and say, well, maybe we should have a Bill of Rights, or maybe we should have a free market economy, or maybe we shouldn't have government so large in our lives.
Sort of like a regression to the mean, right? Instead of rising up, they're going to just bring us down, is sort of the idea.
I think Aristotle and Hesiod and Tocqueville, all of these philosophers, they all postulate that envy and jealousy are the most powerful of emotions, and they can be very destructive. I think Hesiod said there's a good envy, and that makes you see that guy over there and say, he's got a Mercedes. And this is the American attitude. You go over there and you say to him, how did you get that Mercedes? And he said, well, I sold real estate. Wow, I want to be that. The British, or especially the continental European attitude, or most places, is, I want to go kick the door in on that guy. He must have done something wrong, and I'm a better person, and I don't have one.
Right.
And that's why we're in a crisis now with the woke movement, because that's one of its tenets. That the system is unfair, it always was. 1776 is not our founding date. It was always racist, it was always classist, and we need a complete year zero recalibration.
As I'm taking a class, and we were discussing the fall of Rome, and I think since Rome is sort of the model, I suppose, for citizenship that we adopted and everything, I found it also interesting, Rome, citizenship was not like birthright citizenship like it is here.
There's an essay by a French scholar that postulated 240 causes to the fall of Rome, whether it was inflation, or too much military spending, or too little, or given Christianity that destroyed the martial audacity of the legion, whatever it was. But I think one of the more pertinent or compelling reasons was, as it expanded from a republic to a Mediterranean empire, to a global empire, pretty soon tribalization, regionalization, and the system broke down. And that's what's very scary now, because we're seeing it in a variety of manifestations. We're having a red and blue state. People are self-selecting geographically, and we're not having this idea of the melting pot. It's been rejected in favor of the salad bowl, and now the woke bowl that says you have to be racist to stop racism. It's an absurd idea, and the idea that we're going to check our DNA to find ethnic fides, look how ridiculous it becomes. Ward Churchill is a Native American, Elizabeth Warren with high cheekbones, Rachel Dolezal is suddenly black, Sean King is as white as I am, and it's almost as the reverse pattern of Jim Crow. When I was a young kid, you would hear stories of African Americans who were subject to enormous racism, and they were mixed heritage, and they would say pass for white. Now we have people that are passing, and that should tell us something, that the system then is not racially blind. And it's what Professor Kendi says, that it's okay to be racist, to rectify prior racism. But the problem is we're 150 years from slavery, and we're 60 years into affirmative action. And we've forgotten Martin Luther King's content of our character rather than the color of our skin. So we've got a whole generation that grew up in an affluent, leisured America, a multiracial America, but we're somehow looking at the white middle class of the interior of the country, and we're creating all these terms for them, Joe Biden's chumps, dregs, Obama's clingers. And I guess it's just a mechanism, as we said earlier, that you don't want to be around people of a different class. class is something that's mobile and fluid. You and I are in the upper middle class. Tomorrow we screw up, our children don't make it, they can be poor. And so that was a dilemma for Marx when he looked at states or nations that had a fluid upward mobility. Marxism never worked here. But once you calibrate race into the equation, you say, I postulate that everybody who is non-white, we're going to get rid of the old black-white binary. We were working on the legacy of Jim Crow or slavery. But now we're going to create a new word. This is mostly Barack Obama. It's called diversity. Mm-hmm. And guess what? You can be a Punjabi immigrant and farm 10,000 acres, but you are not white, you're diverse. You can be an Argentine aristocrat, and you can be blue-eyed and blonde hair, but if you have a Spanish-sounding name and trill your name, and your name's Tony and you call yourself Antonio, then you are diverse. And that can lead to careerist advantages. And it's a new binary, but it's completely divorced from class. The idea of the civil rights movement, where African Americans had been discriminated so long and so perniciously that it affected their economic opportunity. That was what the EOC was, the Office of Economic Opportunity. It's not that anymore. LeBron is a victim, Barack Obama is a victim. Anybody's a victim if they can claim that they have some meritorious, diverse background. And this is why it was very ironic for me, as I taught mostly minority students my whole teaching life at California State Fresno. And my message was Greek, Latin, French, German, literature, history, archaeology, art, and your identity is irrelevant. Mm-hmm. And we're just going to make you write and speak English better than people on the East Coast in prep schools. That's what I would tell. And I think we succeeded. We sent about 50 kids to the Ivy League, professional schools, classics or law, or medicine. But some of the students that I followed, it's very funny, they have re-tribalized. In other words, if his name was Joe, he's Jose. If his name was Lopez, it's now Lopez. And they are, even though they don't speak Spanish, they're re-tribalizing because they feel that the woke movement will either, if they don't, they will be deemed inauthentic and suffer career-wise, or if they do, they will be rewarded commiserately. And that's really dangerous historically when you see that's what Hitler did, with the idea that even if you speak German, and even if you live in Germany, and even if you follow German law, you're not really fully German because we're going to identify you by the blood and soil of pseudo-Aryanism. And it was one tribe then identifying in a way that transcended shared nationhood. And we're starting to see that now. It's really scary.
What is the positive? I try not to be a negative person. It's very easy to be a negative person. What's sort of the positive takeaway? Like if you look at this country, what are sort of the positive aspects you can see?
When I was 19, I lived in Greece, and I lived there 2.5 years and went all over the Middle East. I have been to every country in the Middle East except Iran. And I look at the world, South America, Asia, and here we're sitting in this student union. It's immaculate. Our coffee is not polluted. There's nobody listening. There's no device that I know of. There's a freedom of expression. And we take that for granted, but it's very rare. And that's one thing. And then when you try to look at that personal experience that we all share, that people are not fighting or blowing up things, or they're not dragging women off and putting them in a burqa. Why is that? Why are we prosperous? Why are we free? Well, we have this constitutional system of 232 years that solved the problem how to divide judicial, executive, and legislative power, and checks and balances, and term limits for the president. And so we have the greatest threat to any constitutional system is the absorption of power. We've stopped that. And the result is, and we have a free market. We have too much government, too much taxes we've talked about, but we still are the freest place in the world. And we're the only multiracial democracy that's ever worked. Everybody says, well, the United States is racist. Nobody ever tries it. Brazil's the only one I know. It doesn't work very well. India can't do it. They've got all of these caste systems and hatreds. Most countries are uniracial. If you and I decide tomorrow, I want to be Japanese, let's go to Japan, they'll never fully accept us because we don't look Japanese. Ditto China, ditto Mexico, ditto Tanzania. But this country has redefined America not in the image of the original settlers from Europe, but as an idea. That's a very rare and powerful doctrine. If we get to the specifics, as a classical historian or military history, I always say to myself, what makes a society powerful? How do they project power beyond, and I don't mean just military, cultural or political or social. There's only about 6 things. One is fuel, transportation. In the horse age, do they have big plains where horses can graze, or they have wagons, or do they have early steam engines? In our case, we're the largest producer of gas and oil in the world. I know that Joe Biden's cut 3 million barrels off, but we still are. If you look at food, in terms of actual dollar amount, we're the greatest producer of food in the world, and we're by far the most productive. China is going to have trouble feeding itself, not the United States. The United States will never have problems feeding itself. If you look at education, if you look at, say, the Times educational supplement, or surveys that come out of Japan, not Americans, and they look at the top 20 or the top 30 universities, and they don't do it in terms of their English department or their gender studies. These studies are calibrated on their medical schools, their law schools, their business schools, their engineering, especially math, computer science. The United States usually rates about 17 out of 20 or 28 out of 30, and it's just predictable when you read them. Caltech, MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, and then these big universities, Michigan or University of Texas or UCLA, and that's pretty much all of the universities in the world. So even for all of our criticism of education were there. And then, so you got food, you got fuel. If you look at military, I'm a big critic of the $800 billion. It's bloated. I think our generals and admirals have become woke, but our military is the most powerful military in the history of civilization. And you can calibrate that by any quality and number of planes, or aircraft carrier task forces, or submarine lethality. So it's just remarkable. And so when you look at all, and as I said earlier, we have the largest economy in the world, and when you calibrate that economy to the number of people actually living in the country, it's pretty amazing. It's 2 or 3 times more productive than China per person in goods and services. So we have all the ingredients, and history says to us, our problem is not, we're not going to eat, we're not going to defend ourselves, we can't educate it. We do it so well that we don't even think of it. We're on autopilot and we don't replenish it. I think all we have to do is, like we did during the Great Depression or on the eve of World War II, get serious and say, we're coasting, we're on the fumes, we got to recalibrate ourselves to what citizenship is, and we'll be fine. And we're going through a cultural revolution right now. Not like Mao's, but something that could be dangerous, and yet it's really because all of us are so affluent and leisured and blessed, and it's not out of dearth or poverty. And we should remember that a lot of civilizations decline or they vanish not from barbarians over the horizon or they starve to death, but because people no longer believe they're better than the alternative, or they believe you have to be perfect to be good. And Americans just got to get back to the basic idea. We never made claims that we're perfect, but we're better than the alternative, and that's good enough.
So I really like that a lot, actually. I like that idea. So what are you're talking to student, 20-something years old, right? What are practical kind of, if you were to lay out, Dr. Hanson's game plan for something, like what are practical steps that every day,
20-year-old?
Well, 21-year-old, like practical steps every person can take to sort of like make a difference, or
I think the problem we have with 20-year-olds is they have been sold a bill of goods that they have to be cosmically moral, or cosmically politically correct, or cosmically woke. And they neglect things that are the ingredients of a successful and productive citizenship. So every 20-year-old should say to themselves, am I self-sufficient? Am I polite to people? Do I follow the rules of civility? Am I fair to people? Do I judge people on the content of their character? And then they have to say, am I autonomous? as much as a 20-year-old can be. I do not want to be dependent on people. I want to be productive. I want to be the person people come to for advice. I do not want to go to other people for subsistence. That was the idea that Jefferson and what Tocqueville saw, that what made America work were the yeoman farmers. And they combined their mind with their body, and they were not a dependent class. And even Tocqueville even talks about prolonged adolescence. You don't want to live in your parents' basement. At some point, you've got to say, I'm going to be a citizen. And that citizen requires that most, not all, we're not demanding everybody, but most citizens are going to marry, they're going to have children, they're going to buy a home, they're going to be self-sufficient. And at a very early age, a person say, that's my trajectory. And it's kind of an attitude of do no harm. But if you do the opposite, if your own life is a mess and you're not able to take care of yourself, but you're judging people all the way across the world, or you're living in Palo Alto and you're saying, I can't stand those people in Mississippi that you've never seen, then you're cosmically woke, but you're personally a liability. And so that, I think, is the biggest problem that I have when I see young people. Because I teach at I'm a fellow at Stanford University. I don't teach anymore there, but I do interact with a lot of students. And they have this misguided notion that if they have a high test score, or they lived in the right zip code, or they drive the right car, then that gives them sort of an exemption from concrete reality. And they don't have any balance. So if you say to an Ivy League kid who is the epitome of, what would you do if the lights went out?
Right.
Do you know how to change a circuit breaker? Do you know how to use a chainsaw? These are all skills that the average American was excelled at. When George Patton raced through Europe from August 1st to September 5th, let's say, of 1944 in the Third Army, people were curious, how did he do it? The occupied French that were being liberated, the British, even other Americans. He said it's very simple. American kids grow up fixing things. When our Shermans break down, we don't send the transmission back to the factory. It's not fine-tuned by some German technician. We get the kids that worked on their Model A's. They love taking things apart. That Sherman is fixed, they're crawling over, and they're go, go, go. And then when we hit the hedgerows, they want to make rhinos, they adapt. So what he was basically saying is that generation that came out of the Depression was very versatile, and they were very imaginative, and they were very mechanical. And we've lost that. I think we've got to go back to the idea there's going to be a lot of people in this country who don't need to go to college. They can get a liberal arts education on YouTube, they can get it on the internet, but they can be well compensated with vocational skills. There's nothing more impressive to me than a master cement person or electrician or a plumber. And when I try to do my own plumbing, but when I get outfoxed by ancient pipes under 140 and I call a guy in, it's like watching a maestro at an orchestra. And he's rewarded far better than most of the professors I know. And what is wrong with what he's doing?
Right.
So I know that in the 30s and 20s and 40s, we got the idea of upward mobility BA, but I think in the new postmodern 21st century, it's going to be, let's forget the titles and the alphabet soup that follows your name and look at what you can actually do.
Right.
And I think that's exciting. Is that it?
Yes, sir. I think so.
Okay, that was good, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.